our world is changing dramatically.
Glaciers are melting and sea levels are rising.
Forests scorched, lives lost.
Winds clocked in at 140 kilometers an hour.
In the past 10 years, climate and weather-related disasters have claimed more than 400,000 lives, affected 1.7 billion people, and displaced an average of 25 million people each year. These risks are rising, with more frequent and more severe extreme events predicted. While the climate crisis hits everywhere, it is always the most vulnerable people who are disproportionately affected, those who face multiple other threats, including conflict, violence, and poverty. Many displaced people live in climate hotspots where they are regularly exposed to severe flooding, heat waves, and drought. Marginalized groups, including women, children, the poor, and food insecure, are hit hardest. But climate and weather-related disasters are not inevitable. We have the tools to manage and reduce climate risks and adapt. We can use scientific data to prevent, act early, and limit impacts of disasters, together with communities and partners. And we can finance systems to trigger action before an extreme event strikes, to ensure it doesn't become a disaster, and to preserve lives and livelihoods. Global climate action must prioritize support to the most vulnerable in preventing, preparing for, and adapting to the ongoing climate crisis. Let's tackle this crisis head-on, and let's do it together. We have no time to lose.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this event on getting ahead of climatic disasters. Know, predict, warn, and act. Obviously, extremely apt for today, which is Adaptation and Loss and Damage Day here at the COP26 Climate Talks. My name is Megan Rowling. I'm a journalist with the Thomson Reuters Foundation, which is the charitable part of Reuters. And me personally, I've been covering climate disasters and how we cope with those climate disasters, reduce the risk, and adapt to climate change for about 15 years. And I started to cover this because the UN OCHA chief at the time, John Holmes, started to talk about this at many events and was calling extreme weather the new normal, and that was quite a long time ago now. And for me, I think what's changed is that back then it was all about the recognition that this was happening and that climate disasters were getting worse, but in those 15 years, I see now that we have many, many more solutions and much more knowledge about how to deal with these disasters and how to protect the most vulnerable people, even though we are not able to do it at the pace and on the scale required in order to protect vulnerable communities. But this is what we're going to talk about here today. So I think often in the climate change talks we hear a lot of negative messages about a lack of finance for adaptation and loss and damage, but at the same time there's a lot going on the ground, and so even though it's not enough, we're going to talk about those initiatives and how they are being scaled up. The recent IPCC report that came out in the summer made very, very clear that global warming, even if we stick to the Paris Agreement goals, there is still going to be very big humanitarian impacts from floods, droughts, sea level rise, storms, and so on. And we're going to need to deal with those, even if we do manage to do better in tackling global warming. And we do have the tools available to better understand risk and also to avoid and reduce climate-related losses and damages. And one of the organizations behind this event today, UN OCHA, the Humanitarian Affairs Office, has been working towards building an anticipatory action approach to prevent and reduce suffering, for example, through things like forecast-based finance, which is putting money up ahead of a disaster in order to help communities reduce some of the impacts. And it's been doing those in conjunction with other agencies on the ground, such as the Red Cross and many others. And today, anticipatory humanitarian action is being rolled out in more than 60 countries, and OCHA has provided last year $140 million to scale up some of those pilots on anticipatory action. And so we're going to be looking at some of the lessons from the pilots and discuss the opportunities to expand those further in places like Bangladesh, Ethiopia, Malawi, Somalia, and there are plans to do more. And we're going to look at other innovative and transformative solutions, including examples of risk information, early warning, and we're going to discuss ways to better fund, coordinate, and ramp up that action going forward. First of all, we're going to hear from very senior people in the organizing UN agencies behind this event, and then we're going to go to a panel that's going to discuss some examples of what countries are doing. And then our second panel is going to look at about how these efforts are being funded and how that funding can be scaled up. So first of all, we're going to start by hearing a video address from the OCHA UN Under Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, Martin Griffiths.
Dear friends, I'm pleased to welcome you to this event organized by OCHA, UNDRR, and WMO. This climate conference is critical. Humanitarian aid workers are already on the front lines of the climate emergencies, and they have seen record-breaking floods, droughts, wildfires, and heat waves. But things are going to get a lot worse. The global average temperature is set to increase with devastating effect. In 2020, we already had emergency aid appeals for 12 of the 15 countries most vulnerable to and least ready to adapt to climate change. We now need all the help we can get if we're to reach those people in need. Fortunately, we have tools that can help us predict those needs and act early to prevent suffering. And together with our partners, OCHA has shown that anticipatory action works. For example, in 2020, we helped more than 200,000 people prepare and protect themselves before peak flooding hit Bangladesh's Jamuna River. This was because we were able to analyze the forecast, anticipate, and act early. We're providing $140 million to cover similar efforts in other countries, but we're going to need additional funds to scale up those efforts. All of us must ensure that aid is as anticipatory as possible and only as reactive as necessary. We cannot fail the people we serve. That cost is too high. And so for that reason, I wish you all the best in your discussions today in this extraordinarily important conference. Thank you.
Next, we're going to go to Mami Mizutori. Mami is the Special Representative of the UN Secretary General for Disaster Risk Reduction, and she runs the Office for Disaster Risk Reduction. Mami's going to talk to us today about how the thinking around disaster risk reduction and adaptation has evolved over the years, and how those sort of streams of work are coming together. Mami.
Thank you very much, Megan. I'm delighted to co-organize this important event with OCHA and WMO and share the panel with my dear colleague, Elena, from WMO on this important adaptation in Loss and Damage Day, as Megan already mentioned. So the impact of the climate emergency on our lives and development gain is clear. A warming planet is going to increase only the intensity and also the frequency of disasters and extreme weather events, which are already at unprecedented levels. There is an urgent need to accelerate action to reduce the impact of climate-induced disasters. What do we need to do? The world needs greater investment in climate change adaptation, as called for by the Paris Agreement, and at the same time in national and local disaster risk reduction strategies, as called for by the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction. And I'll talk about this a bit more later. The resilience gap between rich and poor nations is growing by the day, and nowhere is this more apparent than in the lack of climate finance to support adaptation. The needs in developing countries for adaptation is growing, and we also need to invest more in multi-hazard early warning systems. Why? Because the UN Environment Programme's UNEP's new adaptation gap report estimates that the cost for adaptation in developing countries are up to 10 times greater than what is currently provided by public financing for adaptation. Existing commitments on climate finance have still not been honored fully, as we know, and they pale by comparison with what is subsidizing fossil fuel. And another big concern at this very moment is that the COVID-19 recovery stimulus packages in the trillions are in danger of becoming lost opportunities to build resilience, equitable, and green future. Clearly, we need to pivot from response focus after a disaster happens to a focus to greater investment in prevention and anticipatory action, as Martin was mentioning, while also increasing access to multi-hazard early warning systems. And what does it really mean? It means that we need to integrate better the data that we have for the future of climate risk and the data we have at the present and in the past for disaster risk, loss, and damages. So, for example, if a hurricane or a cyclone or a flood strikes a place which nobody lives, there's nothing, no investment, no assets, no houses, then it's just a tremendous hazard. But if it is combined with exposure, houses, infrastructure, where people are living, and especially the vulnerable people that we have just looked at, then that becomes a disaster. So it is important to combine the data around adaptation, climate adaptation, and all the other data around disaster risk reduction, which is about poverty, which is about weakness in the structure of infrastructure, which is about people who are living there. And so what is UNDRR actually doing in order to provide solutions? As Megan was mentioning, we have an initiative called the Comprehensive Climate and Disaster Risk Management Program that we are currently deploying in 15 LDCs and SIDS. And this is to actually combine working with the governments data fit for purpose to design and implement their risk assessment, bringing in all those information that I just mentioned so that they inform their policy and planning. And there are good practices that we already see in SIDS in Philippines. We'd like to expand it to cover all LDCs and SIDS. We also work on a humanitarian context through what is called the Global Risk Assessment Framework. We combine climate data and all the other elements of risk, including for vulnerability and exposure, and we they inform development and humanitarian planning. And this initiative aims to provide the actors in both humanitarian development programs to have a shared understanding of climate and disaster risks. So we also have metrics and data generated by the Sendai Framework Monitor. All the UN member states send to UNDRR their metrics and data around their loss and damages, and whether they have plans and strategies for disaster risk reduction, whether they have early warning system, so on and so forth. And this is metrics and data that can be used for the planning that I've just mentioned. Now, most recently, WMO and UNDRR, we launched a Center of Excellence for Climate and Disaster Resilience in Geneva. And we believe that this will promote a comprehensive understanding of risk across multiple sectors in multiple countries. I'd like to conclude by making 3 strong calls to action. 1, we dramatically need to raise ambition, action, and financing for climate adaptation. The 100 billion annual promise for financing climate action needs to be a reality, and when it does become a reality, the balance should be 50-50 between mitigation and adaptation. Second, there needs to be a significant increase in support for averting, minimizing, addressing losses and damages. It is critical that countries which are suffering get technical support to address their climate-related losses and damages, and we, UNDRR, look forward to contributing to this. And third and finally, we need to accelerate predictable and risk-informed investment and financing. Still, the financing and investment is pretty much short-termed. They do not look into the long-term climate impact, and this has to change. So thank you very much for your attention. I look forward for an enriching discussion today. Over to you, Megan.
Thank you, Mami. It was particularly interesting to me to hear how you're really doing some of the legwork and getting this metrics, this data together, and that can then be used as a basis for action, because without the data, it's hard to know what one is working with. Thank you very much for that. Now we'll go to Elena Manenkova, who is the Deputy Secretary General of the World Meteorological Organization. And Elena, I was interested to see last week that the WMO announced a plan to boost weather monitoring in 75 small island nations and least developed countries, because I think this has been a bit of a blind spot in terms of being able to act, right, on some of the risks. So over to you.
Thanks very much, Megan. Dear Mami, dear fellow panelists, and dear friends of climate, all the audience here and elsewhere in the world. I'm very pleased, actually delighted to open this event together with the UNDRR and OCHA. It's been never the case before in COPs that we were talking strict to the point of disaster risk reduction and early warning systems. And now three of us, our agencies, cannot stand it anymore, and we need to speak and we need to work together. So this is invitation for anyone to join us in the very challenging effort to help with adaptation and resilience. Secretary General Guterres recently called a breakthrough on adaptation and resilience at this COP. And I would like for us to mark the occasion of the COP Adaptation Day, today's day, the way how we strengthen our determination and combine our forces to deliver a more resilient and just world for all. We gather today also as a testimony that the leading science, collaboration and partnership with all entities of UN system and much beyond is required to actually tackle the problem altogether, because in sustainable development goals, every goal is affected by climate change and by disasters. So we know it very well with Mami, because we are dealing with this business as our daily life, and now we are even closer because we actually physically work in the same building. It's no coincidence that UNDRR and WMO works hand in hand, but we need everyone else on board because the issue is very complex. So together we must seize the momentum to build back better. The urgency of this task was further stressed in the latest IPCC First Pillar report on the sixth assessment. So UN Secretary General named us as a red code for humanity. Leading scientists across the globe brought together irrefutable evidence that human-induced climate change is already affecting weather and climate extremes, and the risks are growing. Projections for the coming decades indicate that climate change will increase in all regions, and the last report is very regionalized. It's very good. Please take a look at this. There are fact sheets on every bit and piece on the globe. It's very good and very concrete and easy to understand now. For 1.5 global warming, there will be increasing heat waves, longer warm seasons, shorter cold seasons, big changes in precipitation patterns affecting flooding and droughts, changing in cryosphere affecting water security, changing in the oceans, increasing risk in coastal areas and seas, and so on and so forth. It's a very high degree of confidence of the assessment of many of such changes. And there is difference between 1.5 and 2. This is also highlighted in IPCC report 1.5 global warming. The difference is significant. There are risks in 1.5 and there are even higher in 2. So we, even in the best scenario, we still need to deal with more extreme weather, climate and water events. We need to deal with them. One of the powerful ways to do that is systemic approach for inclusive early warning and action for all hazards, multi-hazards as we call. Today our distinguished panelists will share some insights and highlights of good practices in this regard. And from my side, I would like to just highlight 4 of the main things WMO is enhancing its work at the moment. First is Global Multi-Hazard Alerting System. This is an initiative which needs to bring together all hazards and all extremes in one system of alerting. So we do this, for instance, through the cruise projects which Megan mentioned a minute ago, and through many other initiatives. We are actually applying systemic approach to any work we do in WMO, and we would like to help and encourage others to do the same. We have means and tools and methodologies to follow so that one system can cover multiple threats and hazards. So WMO will scale our work and partnerships, of course, to accelerate access to the best available science and technology, to enable high quality and actionable alerts and warnings, to ensure that citizens have information and able to act on this. We cannot stand the situation that today, according to our most recent reports, 1/3 of vulnerable people on the planet do not have early warnings, do not. So this is an intolerable situation for us, and we really need to move faster in this regard. The second, together with UNDRR, we have recently launched the Center of Excellence. We will work together with UNDRR and all other partners to enhance our understanding of cascading and systemic risks in all domains of UN system, sister agencies, and beyond. To learn more about this, I invite you to also visit the Science Pavilion on this Thursday at 14:30. We will run events on the extremes and disasters around the world. It was more insights from scientific speakers. Third, noting that the tangible impacts of climate change are through water, WMO has convened the Water and Climate Coalition, which is at the moment sponsored by 10 other UN sister agencies. Water stress is ahead of us, and we have depicted a lot of water hotspots. So we are trying to help with this coalition to accelerate implementation of SDG 6 and Water Action Decade. Fourth, WMO understands that more support is needed to help translate weather and climate information into anticipatory action. WMO is trying to step in to provide tailored advice to humanitarian sector. We have recently launched an initiative, and it started showing its roots when WMO experts provide the most succinct and summarized information to humanitarian agencies of UN and beyond. This is very helpful for them for preemptive action and to see the better landscape of the hazards to come, so that they can deploy certain goods and humanitarian aid. So with this, I'd like to conclude my welcome remarks and thank all of you who came and connected to this event today and join us in our strong ambition to help to close the gap in early warnings. And also invite you to join the World Meteorological Day in March 2022, which the theme will be early warning and early action, again, disaster risk reduction. So please be with us, join us. We need your help to close this gap. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elena. I mean, that gap, a third of people, vulnerable people, do not have access to early warning systems. That is a very big gap to fill. But on the positive side, there's a lot of collaboration going on between agencies, which hopefully will enable that gap to be filled sooner rather than later. Yes. Now we're going to watch a short video about the forecasting work that's being done by WMO.
In April, as many Pacific nations were responding to the growing threat of COVID-19, tropical cyclone Harold ripped through our region, destroying homes and erasing livelihoods across all 4 of Fiji's divisions, with total damages amounting to around $100 million.
Iya, santola kami bila kena do wanja otak menitutun rai. Iya na kena pamuri.
The World Meteorological Organization have urged the meteorological services in the world to please shift from forecasting what the weather will be to what the weather will do.
The reason we are introducing impact-based forecasting in small island nations is simply because it will help to save more lives.
Main lesson from TC Herald was that people were prepared for the cyclone, but people were not really prepared for the storm surges and the coastal inundation.
With Harold, listening to the news, we imagine, okay, it was said the wind direction is coming from the land, here from the hills. We all looked to the hills, and everything we did was to protect our homes that was coming from this direction, but then we didn't imagine that there was something coming from the sea.
Globally, the greatest fatality in terms of percentage that comes from tropical cyclone are from storm surge that happens. That is a fact. And that is also one of the greatest area that we find that there is lacking, and that is particularly on people knowing what response they have to take when storm surge happens within coastal communities.
People tend to neglect warnings from Met offices about possible coastal inundation from tropical cyclones. Sometimes the challenge is the language the Met services are using are not very clear.
So as soon as it slowed down and then we started cleaning, then we got a shock. We heard this big rumbling roar from the ocean because we are near the reef. So then everybody turned to the reef. Then we saw these big waves coming in. Yeah. So all the homes over here didn't expect that. So we were a little bit late in protecting, especially with our facilities here around the school. We didn't save anything.
Prior to this, the only information that we will tell you in terms of inundation or storm surge is just the state of the sea. The word that we normally use are phenomenal seas. But if you ask a person living out in Dubai, what are they going to do with the word phenomenal seas? They don't even know what it means. What they need is a new way in which we define it.
Most of the time you will hear in the radio the wind will be 60 knots.
Mariners can expect south to southeasterly winds with speeds up to 15 to 20 knots.
Instead of saying 60 knots, we say we are going to have a wind which can uproot trees.
So by knowing what the weather will do and the impact of it, it will empower people, enable them to act quicker before the disaster arrives.
And then when people understand that, it does not just become head knowledge, it becomes something that they understand internally, and then that compels them to change their behavior, to take the right behavior, when people really understand the impact of what's about to happen.
Impact-based forecasting will help elevate Fiji's level of preparedness as it redefines how we interpret information that feeds into our decision-making process.
If we do impact-based forecast, that way we combine science and understanding of the community. And we can save more lives because there's no point in having a very accurate forecast, but the people don't understand it.
I'm confident this work will help save Fijian lives. It will help manage and minimize risks and help build resilient communities filled with families who know what to expect and how to effectively respond to tropical cyclones.
Well, that was an absolutely excellent example of what Fiji's doing in this area of taking information and turning it into something that people know what to do with so that they can protect themselves. And we're going to hear now in our panel from two examples of the work that countries are doing. So I have on my left Paula Alvarez, who is the Assistant Secretary in the Department of Finance for the Philippines. And then on my right, we have Katialu Gaptialawan, who is Director General of the Niger Meteorological Department. And those speakers will be followed by an intervention from Maria Helena Semedo of the Deputy Director General of the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, which has been working also on projects on the ground. So first of all, we'll start with you, Paula. Paula, can you tell us about how the work that you're doing on disaster risk finance and early warning is helping local communities in the Philippines?
Okay, thanks Megan, and good morning everyone. So the Philippines is one of the most vulnerable countries in terms of climate change and disaster risks. So as an example, in 2013 alone, Typhoon Haiyan actually incurred $2.98 billion in terms of damages. And this resulted to at least 6,300 deaths and around 1,700 people missing. So because of this, the Philippines started to have policy measures in terms of disaster risk finance and insurance, as well as climate adaptation and mitigation measures. So in the Philippines, what we do is we look into climate change, mitigation, adaptation, and disaster risk resilience as a spectrum. So in the one end, you have disaster risk, you have adaptation and mitigation, and in the other end, you have disaster risks. So in terms of disaster risks, one of the main important issues that we need to deal with is the cost of damages. And in order for us to address this, we came up with a disaster risk finance and insurance strategy. So what we do is we made layers of approaches. So first you have the national level. So for the national level, we came up with parametric insurance and a catastrophe drawdown facility from both World Bank and ADB, wherein in terms of emergency, when the president announces a national state of calamity, we have a drawdown facility that we could use to fund actual recovery and other efforts. Aside from that, we're also looking at the Philippine City Insurance Disaster Risk Pool. So we're working with the ADB to look into how we could lower the cost of insurance for those provinces that are highly exposed to disasters. And then on the individual level, we're also looking at how micro, small, and medium enterprises can access microinsurance. So that's on the policy framework for finance. Now you have the actual recovery and reconstruction phase. So in the Philippines, we started to look into how rapid earthquake risk assessments could be used. So that's what we started with. So our Department of Science and Technology came up with a system or a software wherein we could assess the impacts of earthquakes. Based from that, we worked on it. So we built upon it with flood early warning systems for Greater Metro Manila, which is the center of the Philippines. And then we expanded it to include other hazards, such as meteorological hazards, earthquakes, and flooding. So we had to increase these types of systems towards provinces that are more prone to disasters. So aside from that, we've also looked into how, for example, geo-risks tagging could be utilized. So our Department of Science and Technology also started to come up with the Geo-Risk Philippines initiatives, which breaks down risk tagging into three. So we have the Geo-Risk Hazard Hunter. So it gives people through their cell phones like an app where you could look into what are the fault lines that is near your residence or near your office. And then we have the geo-risk analytics. So it's where people could actually look into the different inputs of the different government agencies into what impacts or how do you analyze these types of data. And then you also have the GeoMapper, where the different government agencies can look into and put inputs. For example, you're from the Social Welfare Department. You could actually input what is the data in terms of the people affected. So, you know, it's more on data gathering, data analytics, and how you utilize them. And this cuts across all government agencies because in the Philippines, disaster risks and mitigation cuts across all government departments. It affects the Department of Agriculture, the Energy Department, it affects everyone. So what the government is looking at is how the different agencies can utilize these platforms that is hosted by your Science and Technology Department. So they have the ability to input data based on their perspective or from where they're coming from. At the same time, the public could actually utilize them. So one of the things that has been going on now is how the Insurance Commission is asking, for example, insurers and reinsurers to utilize these data to better price the insurance premium, because that's another issue in the Philippines. Because of our high exposure to disaster risks, the cost of insurance is also increasing. So in 2020 alone, we've already earmarked 2 billion pesos just for infrastructure of the Department of Education. And that's not even covering all provinces. And that's not even covering hospitals and other government infrastructures. That's just for the education department. So that's also what we're looking at in terms of how climate change, adaptation, and mitigation investments can lower your exposure to disaster risks. So that's how we see it as a spectrum.
Right, okay, that's an excellent example of how you're using insurance and then data and putting it all together in order to make the product more affordable and more effective, and therefore, I assume, to reach more people that way with the same amount of money, right? I'm going to move on to Niger now because we have a lot of speakers in this event, apologies. And Katilu, in Niger, I understand that you've been working on insurance for farmers as well as flood warning. Could you tell us a little bit about those initiatives, please, and how those are working on the ground?
Okay, thank you very much, madam. Thank you, first of all, for inviting me to this session. Niger Republic is a Saharan country which is located in the West African part. The impact of climate change in Niger, which is having a 22 million of people, is mainly two things, the floods and the droughts. We have the two. Because actually when we analyze the trend of rainfall, we actually realize that the rainfall is coming up in terms of quantity. But what is happening actually is that we have the quantity, but the rainy days are reducing. So the rainfall are intense. So with this high intensity of rainfall, we usually have floods. Since 2010 till now, 2 million people affected by the floods. And right this year, only this year, we have 66 people that passed away due to floods. Last year, 80. And we are having, so 2 million affected from 2010 till now. So, these are the major problems you are having in Niger, actually. And on top of the security problem you are having, as you know, almost everywhere in Niger we are having a security problem. So now, actually, the problem is that when you come to the drought, during the rainy season, because we have only one rainy season going from May to September, and the crops, at times, the beginning of the rainy season, we will have a lag. We have very dry spell, maybe 1 month or more. And then the effective period of crop production actually reduced to 2 months and a half, or even two months. And we used to have 4 months. So this is the main problem we are facing actually. And for that, the government of Niger decided to assist the farmers by putting in place a program on the agricultural insurance. We are actually implementing it. We set up a national committee of this insurance. The National Met Service is actually a member of this committee. We have not started yet, but for this first phase, we are going to talk to address the drought aspect to assist farmers. But next time, we go for the floods. Talking of the floods, this is the main concern also of Niger. And following the 4 axes of the UNDRR, which this is knowledge of the risk, the monitoring and also the early warning system, and the broadcasting and communication, and the fourth one is the capacity of response of the community. So we are able, in the framework of the UNDDR project, which is adaptation to climate change, disaster prevention, and agricultural production for food security. With this project, we are addressing 2 risks, which are drought and floods. And so then following this, we set up a community and impact-based early warning system. One of even the main tributary of the river Niger, which is the Sirba. We are having so many villages along this water course. So what we did is actually, at the beginning, to have a perspective approach with the population to make sure that they are aware of what we are going to put in place before we do anything. And we are conducting also roving seminars, as we used to do for the agricultural sector. We go before the setting up of the rainy season. we go with all the population, children, women, everybody, to explain what is water cycle, what is actually the flood they are seeing. It's due to what? So we explain all these kind of things, and we come up with some, we conducted some topographical studies because the dam, the digital elevation model the resolution was too coarse, 10 meters. Then we use a differential GPS to actually conduct some studies to meet actually our objectives. So we are able to do that, and we followed by an hydraulic model. We bought an hydrometer we put as an entrance because this watershed is shared at 90% in the Burkina Faso side and 10% in Niger. So we place the hydrometer right at the entrance of Niger so that we can have the discharge anytime. And from this discharge and the study we conducted, we know all the exposed area and the flood area, prone areas. So we come up with a vigilance threshold and even an atlas, a cartographic atlas, which is here along all the river. We have all the threshold here and where the impact that any discharge can actually favor. And the main thing here is that we also in the villages placed a colored scale, which are followed by the villagers themselves, so that they are trained to know the impact of every level of every threshold and the impact associated to the scenario following this threshold. We have a WhatsApp group with them, we as National Met Service and the Hydrological Service, and the project we implemented with the help of the Italians, the Bioeconomic Institution of the Italian National Research Center and the Polytechnic of Turin. And in the Niger side, we have the Water Resources Direction, the Met Service, the Early Warning Institution, and also the Agricultural Department. So that's how we conduct this thing. But the main thing I want to say is that we had a platform which you can actually access, a web-based platform called slapisniger.org. You can even see it now. It's a semi-permanent water course. We will not see something good. I think we have the water level is 50 centimeters now.
So we can see that on the website.
We can see it directly now. Everybody can just take this website and see what is happening in this water course I'm saying, and also on the river Niger. Actually, we are going to the big flooding due to the Guinean flooding. They will see how water is actually going, and the threshold are also there.
Thank you very much for those examples, and I think it's fascinating to see how much, I never knew that there was so much work going on in Niger, and interesting to hear about how important the use of technology, things like WhatsApp, I mean, we all rely on WhatsApp, right? And when it goes down, that's a problem. Right, so we're going to go to the UN Food and Agriculture Organization now, which has been implementing with partners on the ground. And we're going to hear from Maria Helena Semedo, who's the Deputy Director General, and she's going to join us by video link, I hope.
Yes, I'm here connected. Thank you. Hi. And good afternoon to all. Maybe let me share with you what some of the lessons learned from the Food and Agriculture Organization and the importance of the anticipatory actions to reduce or to improve food security and livelihoods. And I would start by saying, as it has been said, that acting ahead of shocks is a priority. If you act ahead, we have faster, more cost-efficient, and more dignified humanitarian action ahead of climate disaster. And I think we heard from Philippines, we heard from Niger, how it's work. And also that anticipatory action is essential part of climate risk management measure to increase resilience across all agri-food sectors and beyond. We conducted some studies in FAO, and it shows that for every dollar invested in anticipatory action ahead of impending droughts, floods, or any other climate shocks, vulnerable households were able to avoid losses worth up to 7 times the initial investment, meaning that without losing everything, they are able to multiply their investment. And for us, we scale up anticipatory action portfolio. We have investments in building capacities for government, partners, regional and country office to better anticipate, absorbing and adapt to climate change. And I think some of the information we heard, how we can support the countries in developing policies, in developing early warning systems, all the information to prevent and to better assist farmers as geospatial or any other technologies. Let me just share an example with you. You know that in 2020, we had a desert locust who affected the Horn of Africa and Yemen. We are able to mobilize $230 million. And with the operations we undertaken with partners, we protect the livelihoods of more than 40 million people in rural areas. We are able to save crops and pasture, and it was valued in 1.7 million. We invest 230 million and we gain 1.7 billion. And you can see how it's important to have anticipatory and how it pays back. But what we need rapid and flexible funding to enable all actors to support the most vulnerable ahead of the shocks and to scale recovery to prevent humanitarian crisis. And this, I can repeat, rapid and flexible funding. And we, in FAO, we decided to dedicate up to 20% of emergency financing towards anticipatory action over the next 5 years. We have development, but 20% is for anticipatory action and approach, and they will be mainstreaming in all climate resilience programming. And they are part of our climate risk management tools and to invest in more capacity development. To conclude, I just wanted to say that we must work together to integrate disaster and climate risk management approach. We need to recognize that we should move from risk prevention to anticipation and investment, and it's not a cost. This is really an investment. And we need to lead the transition from crisis management to risk management in order to build climate resilience. And this, you have to change our mindset, we have to change the way we work, and to be clear that anticipatory action, they pay back. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Maria Helena. I think what's really coming out here is that money is going into these types of programs and projects, and that there is a huge payoff, as FAO has very clearly outlined just then. We're going to move to the second part of our discussion, which is going to be focused on financing and how we get more money into these types of projects. And so we have 4 speakers. Ambassador Sybil Katharina Sorg, who is Director General for Crisis Prevention, Stabilization, Peacebuilding and Humanitarian Assistance at Germany's Foreign Office, followed by Ibrahima Diong, who is the United Nations Assistant Secretary General and also Director General of the African Risk Capacity Group, and then Kevin Horsberg, Dr. Kevin Horsberg, who's the Climate Science Lead in the Office of the Executive Director at the Green Climate Fund, who will be joining remotely. And I think we also have a colleague here from Google's Carmel Group, that is Saya Novo on my far right. So we'll start with Ambassador Sorg from Germany. She's joining us remotely as well. Ambassador, could you please outline for us how Germany sees the barriers to scaling action in this area and how they can be overcome?
Thank you very much, Megan. And ladies and gentlemen and colleagues, thank you so much for inviting me to speak at this very important and timely event. And let me add a bit of the perspective of the donors, perhaps. Climate change impacts are a major driver of humanitarian needs. We heard that. And the needs are already at a record high, outpacing resources and leading to a widening humanitarian funding gap. So what to do? We urgently need to adapt and act early. The humanitarian system must be as anticipatory as possible and only as reactive as necessary. And anticipatory action is one of the few instruments we have, one of the few instruments that can help us being more efficient. It saves lives, yes. It reduces needs ahead of disaster. It is more effective and less expensive. It simply works. And more than that, it is simply the right thing to do. When we know disaster will strike, it is a moral imperative to act. I would like to give an example. We talked about the Philippines earlier. In the Philippines, forecast-based triggers developed by the Red Cross allow for action 3 days before a typhoon makes landfall. Enough time, so, to strengthen shelters, to stock food, to move animals out of harm's way, and to harvest crops. Similar pilots in more than 60 countries show that this concept really makes a difference. It can save up to 80% of the costs. The means we save can be spent elsewhere. But we need to change gears and move beyond these pilots, and we must mainstream and scale up anticipatory approaches. Significant support shown by donors, by agencies and NGOs at the high-level event in September this year built a stepping stone towards an increasingly anticipatory system. And yet, there are still barriers we need to overcome together. I would like to talk about 3 of them. First, we need to strengthen early warning systems. And thank you so much to Mami and Elena for the great work of the organizations in that regard. Germany, together with the United Nations, with the US and the Netherlands, recently launched the so-called Complex Risk Analytics Fund, CRAFT in short, to strengthen analytics and to strengthen quality data. They provide the basis for better policy outcomes for people in need. Second, we need to build anticipatory action capacity locally and mainstream it through implementing organizations. This also requires continued learning and peer support. We invite all of you to use and join the Red Cross Anticipation Hub in this regard. And third, we must fuel the system. We, as donors, need to provide sufficient funding for anticipatory action. Germany, as you know, committed to scale up our own anticipatory funding to 5% of overall humanitarian spending by 2023. And we encourage others to follow. I want to be very short. Let me close by saying it is a great privilege to be here today and to draw on the expertise and experience of all of you today. We need to advance anticipatory action together, and I think we are on a good track to do so. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ambassador Sorg. Again, there's concrete commitment there in terms of percentage of funding that's going to go into anticipatory action from Germany, and one wonders whether other donors might want to join them as well on that. Ibrahim Diong from the African Risk Capacity, you've been in operation for a few years now, working on large-scale insurance to help at the national level for African nations to deal with extreme weather. What's new in your work these days, and what lessons have you learned so far?
Well, thank you very much, Megan. Let me make a general statement, but also walk you through the lesson that we learned at the African Risk Capacity to bring in the African perspective of the conversation we're having so far. I think the general comment is to say I am delighted since I've been here. There seems to be a consensus that we can do 3 things at the same time, and that is adaptation, mitigation, and resilience. And why we're making commitment to actually invest more in adaptation, it's important to understand that resilience is extremely important to save lives. And let me focus on the resilience part because it's very much relevant to what we do at the African Risk Capacity. Just say, first of all, the problem that we're faced with in the African continent is that because of weather-related disasters, as the gentleman from Nigeria talked about earlier, we're dealing with drought, tropical cyclone, and flood in some cases in Africa. But what all these disasters have in common is the human face of climate change impact, and that is the impact it has on food security, communities actually selling their assets to survive, and life being lost. Let me make three very general comments in terms of what we're doing about it as Africans to make sure that those lives not only are lost, nobody is left behind, but also we're saving livelihood. Number one, leadership. And the African Union has decided this problem is important enough that somebody has to lead, in this case Africa, by creating an institution entirely dedicated in dealing with the impact of risk on climate change, and that is the institution I have the honor of leading as the African Risk Capacity Group. And second, to say, I think as of today, we know the technology exists to actually do early warning systems. We have what it takes actually to profile the risk, and you can't address a risk that you can't profile. So therefore, my call for action is that the technology and the tools that you talked about, if we can make them available, accessible, and customized for Africa, it's going to help us tremendously, and let's understand the problem we're trying to address before we come up with solutions. So I hope we can invest more on technology and make sure that Africa has that information. What it does for us is two things. First of all, it allows African governments to make an informed decision what to do with the risk. And if they decide to transfer the risk, obviously insurance will kick in as well. I think second action, equally important, is that in most of our countries, it's extremely important we have a sustainable contingency plan in dealing actually with disaster, particularly disasters that happen quite often. There are other humanitarian agencies that are involved, so it's important that we join our forces and make sure the African government themselves build their own contingency planning so that what we do feed into that contingency planning so they can have a sustainable solution. I think last but not least, extremely critical is the response. Let me make it absolutely clear, even though we are in the business of parametric insurance, we're not saying that's the only solution to dealing with the risk. I know in many African countries, thanks to the donors, we have what we call social safety net initiative. We've had a known insurance product as well. What's important here is the response has to be holistic in a way that we can save life and livelihood. Let me finish by saying, as far as the African risk capacity is concerned, what I have just described, it's not just a theory or concept, it has been tested. We've been around for 8 years. Since our inception, we were able to provide $720 million worth of coverage. We're trying to get that to $1 billion because it's going to be important to get that coverage increased. Second, we've already made payout about $62 million to member states as a sovereign risk so they can actually come to the rescue of people as well. And last but not least, the most important data, it's about 72 million people have been protected because of what I just described. Now going forward, for us to be able to actually scale up what I just described, we need a couple of things. Number one, it is absolutely critical that we provide the funding required for African countries to actually afford and access premium financing so that over time, the culture of disaster risk management is actually embedded in public policy. And Mami and I talk about it quite often, and it's important that we provide that funding as quickly as possible. I think second, to build the capacities of the African themselves so they can actually do it themselves. In the long run, we don't want to create dependency in the African countries. We'll make sure we provide them the tools that they need as well. And last but not least, the call for action for all of us, joining forces so we can build the culture of disaster risk management in Africa so that we can anticipate, because disaster is such, if you wait till it happens, it may be too late. And I hope we can all walk away from here with one image, and that is the community that I visited in Senegal, whose life need to be protected, and we all have a responsibility to make sure we can provide that support. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Ibrahima, thank you. And it's really cutting edge work that the African Risk Capacity has been doing over the past 8 years with protecting 72 million people and hopefully many millions more as well in the years to come. So now we're going to turn to the Green Climate Fund. Dr. Horsberg, the Green Climate Fund is one of the organisations that has actually been delivering on this aim within the Paris Agreement of providing a balance between, within climate finance, between emissions reduction efforts and adaptation. And so I think it's very good that we're able to hear from GCF now on what they are doing to help scale up action on the adaptation side. Please go ahead. Maybe on mute.
No, it's good. Thank you, Megan, and thank you, organisers, for inviting me to speak at this really important event. And I must declare a personal and long-standing interest in the endeavour, because before I joined the GCF this year as their climate science lead, for a decade I was chair of a WMO expert team on disaster risk reduction for coastal hazards, so I have a very strong personal interest in these ambitions. We've seen that extreme events are increasing in intensity and frequency, with small island developing states, SIDS, and least developed countries experiencing the biggest impacts, both in terms of the loss of life, of course, and also economic damages. Another stat for you here: SIDS have lost $153 billion due to weather, climate and water-related hazards since 1970. There's no shortage of statistics encouraging us to act on these ambitions, and act is what we must do. The 2021 IPCC report shows very clearly that any small increments in future temperature, no matter how small, will massively amplify extreme events, heat waves, extreme rainfall, and of course extreme sea levels. And that's why we must strive to meet the 1.5-degree goal of the Paris Agreement. And the benefits of reducing emissions to that target are overwhelming, because by reducing the rates of climate impact, we give planners more time to adapt, and we limit the damage to fragile ecosystems, and of course we improve the effectiveness of our early warning systems. And in responding to the threat of these extremes, the importance of early warning and climate information systems can't be overstated. There's a recent World Bank report that suggested that installing and upgrading early warning systems in developing countries could lead to an extra 23,000 lives being saved every year. And as other speakers have alluded to, there's a strong economic case for investing in adaptation across the spectrum that we've heard of. Analysis by the Global Commission on Adaptation shows that investing $1.8 trillion globally in 5 areas, one of which is early warning systems, between 2020 and 2030 could produce $7.1 trillion in benefits. And obviously climate finance has a very important role to play to ensure that the resources for climate action reach the most vulnerable countries. So the GCF is the main financial mechanism of the UNFCCC for the implementation of the Paris Agreement. We promote a paradigm shift towards low emission and climate resilient development pathways. To date, GCF has allocated over $10 billion of climate finance across 127 developing countries, 190 projects, leveraging co-financing of $27.1 billion, which makes the GCF the world's largest climate fund. And we target half of our adaptation investment. Our portfolio is balanced between adaptation and mitigation, and then furthermore, 50% of the adaptation is targeted towards least developed countries, SIDS, and African states. GCF funding committed to climate risk and early warning projects currently exceeds $1.8 billion with co-financing of over $2.2 billion. And in all of these projects, we're working with partners to fill capacity gaps, turn the early warning actionable information into effective action through improving communications and preparedness planning, and making sure that the financing covers all of the segments of the warning system value chain. Because as we've heard, addressing risk and reducing vulnerability requires action across a range of areas, from the technology of the systems themselves to embedding risk awareness and climate knowledge at the community level, as well as in policy and planning. And delivering projects across that full spectrum is essential if we're going to provide the integrated approach that gets us ahead of disasters. And the GCF is in a position to provide flexible support through combinations of grant, concessional debt, guarantees, or equity instruments to leverage blended finance and to bring in private investment. Crucially, we promote policy change, institutional change, and financial innovation to remove any barriers and guarantee the long-term sustainability of these projects and their scalability. So I'll just finish by saying that we look forward, we stand ready to work with a wide range of international partners, including all of those in this forum, to coordinate, to fund, and to implement the best projects in early warning and disaster reduction. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Kevin. Thank you. Good to hear what GCF is doing in this area, more than $1.8 billion deployed for this. Now we're going to go to Seya, who's the head of Google's Carmel Group. I think it's exceptionally interesting to be hearing from private sector here because this has been kind of the holy grail, I think, in terms of getting more finance into adaptation. And this has not been particularly easy because it's been seen as an area that isn't so much of interest to the private sector because there's perhaps less profit to be had, especially when it comes to working with vulnerable communities. So please do tell us how Carmel sees the private sector as being able to support these kinds of efforts that we've been hearing about today.
Yeah, so first of all, thank you for having me. It's an honor to be part of this important event and broader kind of discussion. I want to start with one place where I think the private sector can help, and that's in helping bring new innovation into this important work. So there's been in the past decade just immense progress on a lot of the tools that we have to tackle these challenges. I've personally had the privilege of being part of the revolution in hydrology and flood forecasting, but similar innovation is going on in earthquake aftershock prediction, in weather nowcasting, in locust breeding ground prediction, in post-disaster damage assessment, and so on. And sometimes this progress struggles to make its way to the public sector, and I think that private companies can be an important tool to help provide access to governments to these innovative solutions. But indeed, of course, if we want to scale, the funding has to come from somewhere. Sometimes, I think private companies can recognize either the influence that this may have on their own investments or on their social responsibility towards the rest of society. The Carmel Group under Google is dedicated to using Google's resources for tackling humanitarian development and climate-related challenges, and includes dozens of engineers, researchers, product managers dedicated to trying to help. All of this for free without funding coming from elsewhere. Google has hundreds of other engineers and researchers focused on these kinds of not-for-profit efforts. But of course, as you mentioned, it's kind of challenging to achieve this goodwill when the incentives are not there. I think a lot of important funding in the anticipatory action space comes from insurers and reinsurers that kind of have the financial interest to invest in these kinds of solutions. But I also don't want to present a naive approach. I think everyone in this room knows that free market incentives don't always align with the optimal solution. And that's why I think that to complement these, one of the most important things that we should be investing in are public-private partnerships. Governments clearly have the mandate to do important work in this space, the trust of their citizens to inform them, and the moral responsibility to own this life-saving space. And I think governments should be using private companies as a tool to make sure that they achieve their goals. And they can do that by proactively providing incentives, demands, and goals, providing oversight for work in this space, and in general trying to more proactively design their interfaces with private companies to make sure we can utilize a lot of that new technology, but in ways that serve the public rather than serving other interests. To try to achieve that, just maybe one last thing for me. I think a really important cornerstone on the way to achieving that is having open data, allowing more companies, international organizations, nonprofits to have access to data, of course not personal data, but kind of, for example, stream gauges, as were mentioned in earlier conversations, which allow more innovation, more competition, as well as open benchmarking. Sometimes people are worried about finding out what doesn't work in their current systems, and that's stopping our ability to make progress. I think that once we do that, we'll find A, that the costs that we currently have go down. There is room for innovation in doing much more, even with less resources, but B, find new and innovative ways to invest those resources to achieve all of the returns we've heard from the previous speakers. So with that, I think I'll end. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. So it's about encouraging innovation, it's about technology, and the finance is just kind of part of the bundle, I guess. It's about joining forces and and sharing expertise and knowledge. I'm not sure if we have Selwyn Hart with us, who's the United Nations Assistant Secretary General for Climate Action, who is due to close the event. We don't have Selwyn. Oh, we don't. Okay, all right. Well, in that case, we have a few minutes left. I think that it would be good to hear a little bit more from our speakers who are here on the panel, as they have kindly given us their time to be with us here today. I'd like to close by asking each of the speakers, and we'll just go from left to right. Excuse me for the impromptu question. But what for you, very briefly, as we have about 5 minutes left, what for you would be the most useful policy, or the most useful change, or the most useful thing that can come out of this COP26 conference in order to help you with your work and to push forward the anticipatory action and the risk reduction that we need to see for vulnerable communities on the ground? Paula, I'll start with you.
Yes. I think the most important outcome would be how to facilitate technology, especially for local communities. Because, for example, in the Philippines, the most vulnerable ones are those at the coastal communities, the farmers, the fisher folks, and those indigenous peoples living in the outskirts, and they are actually experiencing 3 times faster in terms of the sinking of coastal erosion. So I think for us to better equip them with the knowledge, you need technology transfer, and this issue has been really long discussions in this conference, and I think we really need to actually come out with how to implement them. What kinds of technology could we use to help early action and to better evacuate them in terms of forecasting typhoons and other disasters.
So we need real links between what's the policy discussions that are happening here and what can be used by people on the ground. Eleanor, I'll turn to you next.
Yeah, it's a very challenging question. You can hear me, yes?
Yes.
Okay. So I have like myriad of answers in my head right away, because it's my 12th COP, and WMO is all about systematic observations and science. But just allow me 2 things out of my chest right away. First, we have launched together with the Green Climate Fund Science Basis for Adaptation. We have seen that a lot of investment, hello Selwyn, I will not be very long, hi.
Hi,
A lot of investment is with all good aspirations is not as effective as it could be. Together with Green Climate Fund, we developed the tool, step-by-step procedure, what every adaptation project should start with. So it helps us to embed multi-hazard early warning systems and all the things which I won't spend time. And the second is common alerting protocol. This is a must. Everyone on the planet should have access to the same quality, same authority, warning information. Saving lives is government responsibility. Common alerting protocols are the must. So we'd like to have this, to see this everywhere on the planet. Thank you.
Absolutely, thank you. Mami, Selwyn is now with us. So if we could just give very swift answers, and we'll leave the closing.
So of course, the very core of this COP is what is going to come out from the negotiations of the member states, which we have very high expectations of. But I would add that the partnership element that we've been talking about is very important, that we need to work with the governments, national, local, partnership with private sector, partnership, of course, UN system, communities and cities, and of course, the youth that we talk about a lot, but we don't necessarily include enough. So a strong sense of we need to enhance partnership in order to enhance what comes out from the COP.
Excellent, thanks. And we've been doing that today. Ibrahima.
Very quickly, obviously, I have to plug in this initiative that we're involved in, which I think is going to be a game changer with regard to risk transfer, is the establishment of what we call an African Premium Support Facility, which will allow Africans to access and find premium financing affordable. What that will do, it will help not only provide the necessary subsidies to build a culture of disaster risk management, but over time, as the culture is built up, countries will begin to pay their own way and transfer the risk with their own budget. And this is the time just to say the word delightful, delighted I should say, that Germany has provided 18 million euro to that premium funding support I just talked about, with the hope we can get other donors to chip in, so we could make premium financing affordable and accessible.
So concrete finance commitments, yes. Okay, Katiolu.
Okay, thank you very much. What I should retain from this COP is, I think maybe we'll be optimistic, even though we don't know really what will happen after. But the main concern, as I said, is as far as African countries, particularly Sahelian countries, are concerned, is adaptation. Right. Adaptation, as you know, and this early warning system for now, we have just started. We need more of early warning. We saw, for instance, even this year, one of the cases that really pain us is we lost 8 lives just for lack of information. Right. We gave out the information in the Met Service, but we don't have any early warning system in place.
So much more support for early warning systems.
And they died very simply because they were not aware.
Because
so
we
I think
see that in
we should put more
lives.
money in this adaptation for our countries.
Absolutely. Okay, Sarah, briefly if you can.
Yeah, I'll just complement the important needs already mentioned by mentioning the importance of standardization. There are thousands of forecasters worldwide and thousands of distribution systems, but it's very tough for them to communicate with each other. I think if we had better standards for raw data, for forecasts, and for alerting, that would move the field significantly forward.
Excellent. Thank you very much for those final remarks from the panelists here in the room. And we now have Selwyn with us. Hi, Selwyn. Good to see you. Yes, I'm not sure how much of the event you've been able to catch, but what are your thoughts here on adaptation, loss and damage day here at the COP? What's key for the UN and for taking this anticipatory action forward that saves lives and money and really helps people on the ground?
So thank you so much.
Could we have Selwyn's mic?
It's on now. Thank you so much. It's certainly a pleasure to join this panel and to join all of you here this afternoon on Adaptation and Resilience Day. And as we head into the final week of the COP, it is clear that there is this really strong groundswell of support for urgent and ambitious action on adaptation and resilience. And we all know what the science is saying. At current levels, we're seeing unprecedented impacts all over the world. And even if we were to hold the increase in global average temperature to 1.5 degrees Celsius, we will continue to face escalating and more intense climate-related impacts. And as you know, we are not on track to hold the increase in temperature to 1.5. We're still based on the indices on a calamitous 2.7 degree pathway. So we know that this agenda must be advanced urgently, and we need ambitious deliverables and concrete and credible deliverables on adaptation and resilience. Now, and we know that adaptation and resilience, it works, and early investments protect lives and livelihoods. And the good news is, as I have heard, and my colleagues have told me as well, who were following online, that all of you have come to the table with really great tools and instruments to address this challenge. And that's the good news about this story, that the financial tools and instruments and technological solutions are available. They're available now. They're not available in the future. They are available now. But we face two challenges. First, not enough support is being provided to people's communities and nations on the front lines of the climate crisis. And second, the countries that and people who need this finance more, this adaptation and resilience support most, continue to face insurmountable challenges in accessing climate finance. And it's remarkable that 30 years after international, or close to 30 years of international climate negotiations, adaptation finance represents a mere 25% of total climate finance support, despite what we know and what we're seeing and experiencing all over the world. 25%. And countries on the front lines, like the SIDS and the LDCs, they are not getting access to the finance that they desperately need. Climate finance to SIDS in 2019 declined by 25%. And these countries who are acknowledging every decision on vulnerability in this convention received in 2019 1.8% of total climate finance flows. This is unbelievable, and quite frankly is a source of or should be a source of outrage. But I think that it is our collective responsibility to fix this problem. And as I said, the solutions are there. The financial instruments like the ARC and the CCRIF in the Caribbean, the instruments are there for addressing this challenge. And this is why, and I'll be finished soon, that the Secretary General continues to call on donors to allocate at least 50% of their climate finance support towards adaptation and resilience. Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, 25% is not balanced. And we know that the cost of adaptation, and this 25% is a mere $20 billion a year, and there are estimates that the adaptation costs in the developing world could rise to as much as $300 billion a year. So there's an urgent need to increase the volume of adaptation finance to fix the incentive system in the MDBs, in the bilateral agencies who are very focused on mitigation, and rightfully so, but a lot of the mitigation activities can be dealt with through private finance. We know that adaptation is harder. It is harder. Information and data is needed. A lot of it is sorely needed. The transaction costs are higher, and the profit margins are in many instances non-existent. But we must do it collectively. And we also need, on the access front, clear commitments from the MDBs and donors to reduce red tape and bureaucracy, especially for the vulnerable countries, to support capacity building activities in these countries, to enable them to develop projects and access resources, and finally, to address the eligibility issues that many of these countries face. So, in conclusion, as you would have heard today and you will hear today throughout the day, the stakes could not be higher for countries, communities, and peoples on the front lines of the climate crisis. I am an island person from Barbados, and I know I have seen it in my region. I've seen it in the Pacific. I've seen it in other parts and other islands all over the world. The stakes could not be higher for islanders, for LDCs, for countries in Africa, vulnerable countries in all regions as well. And this is a race that we cannot afford to lose. So I thank all of you. Continue your good work. You have our full support. This is an agenda that the Secretary General has prioritized, and we look forward to working with you the day after Glasgow to ensure that these 30 years, we can